B.Math, Bryant, and the Ep5 podcast. I wanted to come on to cover a topic that I've always found interesting, but I don't think very many people pay attention to, think about, or even think there's something they can do about, and that's the relationship between productivity of the individual and government. Is an important topic to cover, especially with the events surrounding this current election and what it really amounts to. So many people, they go to vote the same way they voted the past 5, 10, 15, or 20 years, and they're not really paying attention to what it means on the larger scale. Most people can only handle one topic at a time. It's either you're for this or you're against this. It's either you're for this or you're against that. And they can't handle gray areas very well, especially when it comes to freedom, which is kind of an interesting topic although itself, which I'll probably discuss at a different time. But right now you're looking at what amounts to America as we've known it, which I'm not going to say it's a constitutional America or a federal republic, because it isn't. It's been fairly well usurped by mega corporations and the Federal Reserve Bank, and in truth by a government that won't limit itself and the people who won't limit it. But the semblance of liberty that we did have is yards and yards better than what we could have, which is a democratic socialism, as they call it, or actually Marxism. And this all stems to productivity and government. In a Marxist society, it's a collective. Everybody sacrifices any individual liberties and rights, for all intents, declares government their god. And that's exactly what it is in communism and Marxism. There is no religion, there is no higher authority than the government itself. The people fall to the whims of whoever's in charge in the government at the time, under the belief that government will take from those who have more than they do and redistribute it to those who don't have any. Of course, most people know that in circumstances when that happens, everybody ends up with pretty much nothing except for those who are in power, and somehow, some way, those who are in power end up with everything. Along the way, this has always worked because the people have been stripped of their weapons or ability to defend themselves or overthrow a government. And of course, the government implements a strong military backing, because a armed military can subdue an unarmed populace fairly easily. And that's what you see over and over again in any Marxist communist takeover and revolution. And you can look these up. There's plenty of examples. In fact, there's one going on right now in Venezuela. I believe Bolivia is having a lot of turmoil as well. And any of the people who come from the countries of Venezuela or Cuba or Colombia or any other former Marxist communist state, they can definitely vouch for the scenarios that we are seeing now as beginning stages of revolutions that push towards communism. On the other hand, we have government that is supposed to push for and protect the individual liberties and the individual's ability to provide for themselves. And on the other hand, we also have the current state and believe that they have certain freedoms, but to a vast degree, you're still able to work hard, make money if you work hard, and benefit from the fruits of your own labor. And that's where personal and individual freedoms fall into place. The interesting thing is that the financial arrangement that we have and its ties to government are exactly the reason why we find ourselves in the position that we are today, where we are attempting to stave off Marxism, communism. And this has been well on its way ever since 71, when they took us off of the gold standard. What a lot of people don't understand is that big governments and the institutions that they put into place have to have financing of some sort or another in order to survive, in order to have power, in order to grow. And that's the case of any government that wants control. It needs to finance its operations. The only problem is that government does not have money in and of itself. Now, typically what happens is government goes out and it taxes people and takes their money to provide for the government. And that's wherein the link between productivity and government comes into play. So people go out and they work and they try to create goods and they offer services, they get paid for them, and the government comes in and tries to take a chunk. Now, this is definitely, should sound kind of mafioso-ish, because that's exactly what government is. And people have long forgotten that government is something to consider as a necessary evil and should always be feared. It's exactly what the founders begrudgingly put together, and they knew it, and you can see it in their writings. They knew that giving power to a governmental body was a risk that they had to take, but it was an essential one, because those who are looking to have individual liberties and freedoms can't stand alone on an island to defend them, and somebody is always going to come along to try to take from those who have individual liberties and freedoms. There are always the bandits who do so, and so in order to attempt to prevent this, the founders tried to put together some kind of a framework of a government that would have minimal ability to inflict pain and suffering on the individual. And they believed that by spelling out exactly what the government could do, it was supposed to be taken that the government couldn't do anything else. Unfortunately, since that time, there has been little bits of chipping away and chipping away and chipping away at that until we end up in the current state we are. Most of that chipping away had been done by the judiciary and their belief that they could read the Constitution however they felt it satisfied their own personal bias. And then once those were in the law books as a case, other judges would reference them, and slowly but surely you walk away from the individual liberties that were originally set, and the original powers that were bestowed upon the government, and the government gets more powers and the people get fewer liberties. And that's kind of how it takes place. But that's not all that chips away at it. Few people probably know, in regards to taxes, that after the Civil War, there were a couple of different methods that they pushed through to try to pay for the Civil War. And one of those was an income tax. Of course, that was thrown out. It was thrown out in 1902 by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. And this is something you can actually look up. So what happened was the states got together in the Congress, and they passed it as an amendment. So they took something that was declared unconstitutional and forced it through as an amendment. Why would they do that, you might say? Well, what state doesn't want to collect revenues from members of its state, and what government, federal government, doesn't want to collect further revenues from the people, from its populace? And that's all to fund itself and its own entity. So definitely had motivations to keep its own interests and its own power steaming along, and so they passed it as an amendment. Yet the people didn't come through and attempt to fight it. So many times throughout our history, you've found that things have been passed through and people just have not had the ability to, or the care or the wherewithal or the knowledge to stand up and say, no, we're not going to put up with this stuff. There have been instances in which they have stood up and the government wasn't able to allow things to go through. One of those was obviously when they outlawed alcohol. Of course, the people stood up for that one. Go figure. I mean, that's the one that's probably the least relevant to your individual liberty, but it definitely numbs the pain in times when you lose your job, or times of loss and sorrow just in general, and then, of course, times of celebration. And that was one that was fought for. The ones that really made a big difference were kind of kept by the wayside. But the government snuck through a ton of stuff that way. The Social Security tax that was pushed through as a benefit for society that wasn't going to be permanent. Almost all of these were pushed through that weren't going to be permanent. But by the time you rolled through and 5 or 10 years had passed, people kind of forget about it. And so many other things happen that it just goes on and on and on. A really good example of that is the organization of the TSA. And that was 20 years ago now. That passes through and gets implemented thanks to the Patriot Act. But now we are a generation through, and a generation that has grown up not knowing the TSA didn't really exist, and not knowing that the TSA is in a violation of all of our liberties and rights in and of itself, just like most of these other institutions. They just go along with it thinking that's part of it. There are so many things that the government has created and taken from the people that should not be, but have been, for lack of a better word, allowed to be by the people, mostly because of the lack of an education system that actually teaches you what your rights are and what rights of government should be, and so on. But it goes beyond that. Looking back to how government ends up paying for this stuff, we have to go back to productivity once again. If you look at the cycles of government, what always happens when one party comes into office or takes control of the Congress and the executive branch, or the other party does, somebody raises taxes, somebody lowers taxes, somebody raises taxes, somebody lowers taxes. And of course, the people cheer one way or the other. Mind you, the entire time that income tax is unconstitutional and shouldn't be in play in the first place, but it makes people happy to have taxes raised because one party wants the wealthy to be taxed and the other party just wants a break, and they want to be able to have a little bit more money so they can put food on the table or maybe take that vacation for the year. And in the end, it's always the middle class that gets screwed anyway, no matter whether they say it's the middle class that doesn't or it does, mostly because of the fact that the other tidbit people don't really understand is that the financial system, the way it's set up, is done in such a way that people who have financial, economic, or just business know-how can structure things in such a way to avoid a lot of the taxes that come into play through a number of means. And these aren't illegal means. People, scream and shout and say, "Oh my God, they didn't pay taxes, they didn't do this, they didn't do that." Well, the thing is that you could go about and create a structure, an entity, and attempt to go off on your own and be your own business person, or structure your holdings and assets in a particular way that would save you tax credits as well, or save you taxes as well. But you don't do it. You just complain. You want somebody else to attack the people who have done it and have been smart. And the funny thing is that all of the attacking, generally by the people who are doing the attacking, are the ones who want that money to go into their own pocket. And so what happens through government, especially now, is that not only is government funding themselves through your productivity by taking your money, but now they're funding other people by taking your money. I'm not really sure how that can't be construed as bribery, because if a politician comes in and says, "We're going to take money from the rich and we're going to create all these programs," how are you not buying votes from the people who are going to be registering for those programs? Maybe it's a fine line, but it's something that probably should be considered. And it in fact was. But let's not even get into programs that are created. Let's just talk about government in general and what happens when they tax you on all of these different items and taxes continually to go up, or they just create new taxes. And of course, it's never questioned. If it is questioned, somewhere along the lines, you're strong-armed. Somebody audits you. Somebody, does something somewhere along the line. They use the government to strong-arm you, which is why I said you should probably consider government a mafioso tactic, because that's exactly what you get, is some strong-arm tactic along the way that is going to force you to comply with whatever they mandate or put into place. On top of that, what other entity can vote for their own paychecks? Does anybody ever sit down and think how it is that all of these people, even if they're a town council or a mayor or a county judge or a state representative or whomever, they don't have any limits on how long they can be in government? They get full pensions, they have separate health care plans, and they all make significantly more than everybody else They get more time off a year than teachers do. They only have to be called into session when they get called into session. It's absolutely appalling that the people decide to put up with this stuff. And then everybody chimes in now, especially I'm going to be the next, so-and-so, and I'll fight for the little guy. And, they're claiming to be a Republican wave of people. And you can look at the Congress that we have, and you might have 5 people who actually are for smaller government and would cut back on wages and benefits and all of these other things. But the rest of them, they might say they would, but they don't. And they just take your money to put into their own pocket. And then they convince a whole lot of people to vote for them because they convince they're going to take your money to put it into other people's pockets. Now, when I'm referring to that, obviously it's the working class, the people who actually are working. And you see the stats over and over again. You've got 50% who work, who fund all the taxes, and 50% who don't, who collect all of it. Well, now we have a lot of deficit spending, so other countries are now funding this, but that's kind of a story or a tale for a different day. But people have to begin to consider the fact that if you want to rid yourself of the current situation that we have, you can't just go about voting for somebody who's going to say that they're on your side, or they're pro-second, or they're pro-first, or they're pro-whatever. If you want to actually implement a change for the benefit of the people, the entire thing has to be switched up to where there are actual term limits for representatives and congressmen. There's no reason for a senator to be in the U.S. Senate for more than one term. There's just no reason. There's nothing that you shouldn't be able to get done in one term as a senator. There's no reason you should have more than 2 terms as a representative. There should be no pension. Government was supposed to be a burden. It was never meant to be a full-time job. Government was what the founders did in their off time. They came together to address whatever issues they found developing amongst different states or different entities in the exchange of commerce or need for defense, and come together, solve those problems, go back to doing their everyday life. It was never supposed to be something that was continual and passing all of these laws. The fact that people think that, oh my God, they're not doing anything, they're not passing anything. Oh, they did away with the filibuster. Yay. People don't understand that government wasn't supposed to be passing stuff. They were supposed to be in a deadlock. That's the way the government was designed, so that only things that were absolutely universally felt to be true and needed would pass through. How hard is that to understand? But what you end up with is that people who, they have their belief that they're right and everybody else should succumb to whatever it is their opinion is, and so they vote for government to force their opinion on everybody else. And that's wherein you have the people who are true advocates for individual freedom and individuals to be accountable for themselves, and those who are just power-hungry twits who don't want accountability. And you can definitely see the difference between these two, but government isn't your solution. Government is your problem, especially a government that we have today. The tentacleized government that has arms and tentacles in every single operation of your daily life. And then it can take from your productivity to fund itself. And it doesn't have to be accountable to anybody. And it really isn't. If you actually look, there are so many entities that the government has created that are not voted in, and they will be in power for 20, 30, 40 years, that the government now is run by people who aren't voted in, which is where we end up in our structure today. And you might wonder really what the main catalyst and main cause of all this was. And it goes back to our financial system. And like I said, when we went off the gold standard in 71, the ability to print fiat money is the ability to make money off other people's productivity, much the same the government does to you. Only banking entities do it in kind of a hidden fashion, using a lot of term scenarios and quote-unquote investment vehicles that are complicated for the average person to understand, and so you don't really pay attention to how it works. What happens is say, for example, the reserve system that we have right now and the way the money supply works. And if you're an entity that can just simply print money, let's talk about entities that can just simply print money and how you might react to that. Say your neighbor comes up and he wants to borrow $100 from you. And you say, okay, yeah, that's fine. Here's the $100. And he guarantees that he's going to pay you back at the end of the month, but he'll give you $5 for each week, just interest sake. Yeah, it's a high APR, but let's just say, so he'll give you $120 back at the end. But to you, that $100, well, say you're getting paid $20 an hour. That's not just 5 hours of work. Remember, the government's taking 30% from you. So that's almost 7 hours of work because the government takes from you to give to somebody else in the first place. So that's almost a day's worth of your labor for that $100. And so you have value with that, but you figure for 120 at the end of the month, okay, for sure. That'll make up for you not having it for that month. But then you come to find out that your neighbor is able to just print the money and counterfeit it and then hand it back to you. And then you begin to find, well, first of all, you have to ask yourself, well, why is he borrowing money from me? But also you have to be like, well, why am I working so hard if he can just print money? Why doesn't he just print money and he can give it to me too? Well, that's not all that far off from the system that we actually live in. Banks on a Federal Reserve or on the fractional reserves system, the banks need to keep a certain money on hand with the Fed Reserve, and they can loan out all the rest. So if a bank is, people decide to deposit $100,000 and they have to keep 10% on, well, they hold 10% and they give out the other 90,000. Well, that other 90,000 goes to somebody, and for simplicity's sake, we'll just say they're going to put that 90,000 into another bank. So they put all that 90,000 into another bank, and that bank's got to keep 10%. So that bank puts 9,000 aside and sends 81,000 out, and say another person gets it, and that person puts 81,000 into another bank, and they set 10% aside, the 8,100, and I don't know, I'm not going to be able to do the math right off the top of my head, but they loan it out, and you get the image of it though, hopefully, and you see how that 100,000 has now just increased. You can see how that goes along and then creates money. It's a money multiplier in the fractional reserve system. That 100,000 will go and create $1 million of money supply out of thin air. The interesting thing to note is that your 100,000 that you put into the bank comes off of your productivity to get that 100,000. You've actually done stuff and put together something, whether you manufactured things, maybe you were a worker and you worked a number of hours, or your labor went into creating that 100,000, which is the equivalent reimbursement for whatever your labor output was, your productivity. The bank just took it, and through the fractional reserve system was able to create $1 million for which they are going to make interest on as they loan out this money. So they just made 10 times the amount of money out of your 100,000 of labor by doing nothing. And see, this is a concept that I don't know if it just floats by people or they just see as a necessary evil or what have you, but this is what happens in a fiat system, because there is nothing to stop the bank from creating as much money as it needs. And it goes a little bit beyond this, but the Fed Reserve starts it and it filters down through investment banks, commercial banks, and so on. But creating this money out of thin air as a money supply that was all based initially on someone else's labor and productivity. Now, I'm sure you'd like to just simply take somebody else's labor and make money off of it, but you don't really have the option to do so. And this is all legal and signed off on by the government. Now, why might this happen this way? Time and again through history, governments just simply become corrupt. They want more power and they want to put together more institutions. They want to put together more departments. They want more control over the people. Well, in order to do this, you have to get funding and money. And it doesn't really matter whether you're running a monarchy or you're running a federal republic. It doesn't really matter. Once the government decides it's going to expand and need money for other things, it has to go about getting that money somehow. Well, if you were to run on an asset-backed currency, you would be devaluing your money if you needed more money. I'm sure you've heard of this stuff. The more money you print, the less each bill is represented by the quantity of whatever asset, say it's gold or something like that. And so there becomes an inflation. You devalue the money when you inflate the money supply. And in order to prevent this through a fiat currency, there's nothing that you're comparing it to anymore. The only thing that plays in is if your currency is still willingly taken by people representative as a medium of exchange, if it's still taken for those goods. If somebody's offering you that cash for a chair or a table you made for them and you're like, yeah, I'll take it. Well, okay, that's a swap. That's your exchange. As long as you're still willing to take it, you're good. A bigger issue comes into play, especially for governments of countries, when other countries won't take their money anymore. And that's kind of a key for our government, because we do so much deficit spending that we, for all intents, have a credit card. And our credit card is supplied by other countries of the world who buy our debt, and then we're supposed to pay them back. And that's kind of how we're allowed as a country to run these deficits and have these huge spending budgets. It is all coincidentally backed by the productivity of the country itself. And so once again, it's printing money and putting it on the backs of people and actual production, when it's creating 10 times that amount out of thin air and not actually producing anything of worth. I suppose at some point in time you could probably have argued the government was doing something with the money. Keynesian economists always talk about government expenditures and handing out paychecks to people to do something. They always make the quip that even if you just have them dig a hole, fill it with money, and then dig it back up, that's at least having them do something and you're paying them for it. Of course, you're still printing money out of thin air, which people are going to eventually be held to pay for, because it's based on your tax dollars, which is your productivity that you're paying out. But people overlook this. I guess my entire point to this thing is that people don't seem to understand that the system that we're in and the way it's run, you're literally funding a government that is not only printing money to supply all of these different entities and departments and pay all of these different people, but also pay itself in its own pockets. And on top of that, bribe other people who are on social programs to vote them into office, so then they get money from your pocket as well. And that therein is why the entire system eventually would have to collapse. You would get to the point where there was so much debt, because it just amplifies, it doesn't go away. And there's actually really interesting tidbits in podcasts or videos that people have done as to why you could never eliminate this debt in a debt-based system. But it gets so out of hand that eventually the entire system is kind of shaken to its core and is on the verge of collapse. It should have collapsed in 2001, but that was the first time when it was, I believe, Bernanke had implemented a form of bailout. It just got worse because it was never taken care of in 2008, when that bailout had been instituted. And now we're still suffering from the fallout of those other two financial crises that just never really got solved in the first place. This probably isn't going to wake up a whole lot of people to the situation that we're in, but I've always thought it important for people to understand where it is and what your money and your taxes are going to, because you no longer have a say, it seems, in any of this stuff. The taxes are simply taken from you, and they go to whatever entity that the government deems that it wants to feed it to. And this can hinder your ability to be more free or be more productive, or it can help you be more free or more productive. And I think most people know which direction that has gone in since 71. I am going to put a little bit more together in a video and kind of cover a little bit more about the Fed Reserve and asset-backed currency, and you can look for that to come out. If you'd like to listen a little bit more about where our economic policies come from and how they've meandered down this path and have actually really been set up for us to take the fall, you can listen to some of the episodes 1 through 4. It gets a little bit dry in there, but you listen to some of the points and where all this came from, because truth be told, this isn't something new. These economic policies and government taking from the people have happened over and over again. The devaluation of currency has happened over and over again. And every single time an entity has attempted to both restrict government and restrict the financial system by enacting a asset-backed currency, generally in some kind of coin, but it could also be salt. I mean, empires were built on salt. As soon as they could get away from it, they coerced or tricked the people into allowing them to create loans and credit using the people's money and the people's productivity, and they got the benefit off of it. And this is how the system has always worked. Now, don't mistake me. This isn't saying that all financial institutions are bad or there isn't a need for them, because there is a place in society for financial institutions and the services that they can offer. However, those institutions need to be completely open to scrutiny and auditing in order for the people to really understand what's happening. And the people have to be fully informed as to what is going on with their money and where this money is coming from. See, none of these things would be able to take place in a gold-backed currency, because you can only have money relative to the amount of gold that you actually possess, or any other commodity. Gold just tends to be used because it would be a real pain in the ass to back everything by corn or sugar or orange juice or some other commodity, and so you can take your pick on that if you'd like. There has been plenty of times currencies have been backed by other things, but gold is just the most well known. And in a gold-backed currency, if you restrict the lending power of the banks to only lend on the gold in the bank that has been approved by whoever's owner it is, then you wouldn't have these issues. And I mean, that's actually the banks got in trouble for that a number of times. Obviously there was a need for them, because if you're running around with gold or silver coins in your purse, or your pocket or satchel or whatever, think of the time period that you're going into, you're always possibly going to be robbed or mugged, and then you lose everything that you have, right? That's one thing that was always nice about carrying a digital style system with you, is that it's much more difficult to rob, at least physically. There's other ways, and I think that bad people always find other ways to skirt the system. But during the time period when you carried gold around in some kind of a pouch or something, you always were under that possibility to be robbed. And so there was benefit to having an institution where you could have a note drawn up and use that as your collateral. But then people would view that note as the value and not the gold that it represented. And so they would run around carrying those notes, and the gold would stay in the bank. Actually, also temples were used and goldsmith vaults were used. But once the people who had these vaults and these banks realized, well, hey, we got all this gold on hand, they started loaning it out without ever telling the people and making money off of them loaning out other people's gold. That's where you started to see the first runs on banks and those issues. Well, in order to skirt that, well, then the bank got the okay from the government to print out certificates that weren't represented by anything, and people were still under the guise that they were represented by gold. But then the government would take them off the standard, and so then you were just left with these certificates, and all of this stuff kind of worked in conjunction. A number of situations where it was very sneaky between the financial institutions and the governments, and the financial institutions just happened to be there because people needed a place to put their hard-earned assets or savings, and then just kind of by default the financial institutions found themselves in power because they were holding all of this money, only it wasn't really theirs, and they treated it like it was. And to get around that, if you can get off the asset-backed side and you just have the institutions print all of the money, well, they can control pretty much whatever they want. And I'm not sure if all of that is extremely clear. It's probably clear as mud, but hopefully some aspect of that kind of makes you think a little bit on what exactly is happening. But just simply to reiterate, obviously there was a need for the institutions, and they did provide that need. It just simply got out of hand. The one time it was able to be implemented effectively for a number of years was, like I said, the financial institutions could charge a fee for holding the gold that they were holding, and then could only loan out if somebody approved the loaning out. And of course they would do so because they would be also guaranteed a certain percentage, and the bank would be guaranteed a percentage, mostly for doing the legwork and examining the riskiness of the asset and so on. But I mean, you have to have kind of a person who isn't very risk averse to approve a bank to go do those kinds of things, and then stuff develops from there. But at least the person was well aware that their gold was at risk of being invested in something else, rather than just have the bank do it all on its own. And so there were times in which that was effective, but then it was too restrictive, and governments needed money, and the collusion between governments and financial institutions usually caused the issue. And so you can't really blame financial institutions all by itself, because rolling way back to what I was talking about in the beginning, you can easily see where a government gets out of control. Like I said, we have the benefit of living in the only constitutional republic that was ever created by the people, that mandated what government could do in the history of the world. This has never ever been done. Yet even that, because people have been asleep at the wheel and not really paying attention, or not wanting to learn, or not being taught properly, not truly valuing their freedom, or even understanding what freedom is, have now allowed it to get way out of control, and power proportion is way out of whack, to the point where they're in the position to now control your lives, your finances, your travel, and everything else about it, because of the way the financial system has been let loose. And government has used that benefit to run deficit spending and create money out of thin air, to create as many entities and programs and as much infrastructure is needed to enforce its own authority and power. And so it isn't one thing or another. It's always been, and I think this was probably the wisest thing that ever came out of the founders when they were asked about the government, and they said I think Franklin said it was a federal republic or a constitutional republic, but he said it's yours if you can keep it. And that's the one thing that people are never taught. You have to accept the responsibility and accountability that comes with freedom, and all of the dangers that are inherent within it, in order to keep it. As soon as you believe that another entity can provide things for you, and you hand over some of that accountability, you hand over some of that freedom as well, and you'll never get it back. But as is, I will sign off. Thanks.